Welcome to episode 4, Rallying Our Movement. I'm Eric Lindstrom, Executive Director of Farm Animal Rights Movement. In this 4th episode, we'll address the key instruments that turn a collection of inspired, dedicated individuals into a thriving movement. These include conferences, associations, collective mass actions, magazines, and books. Prolific author Victoria Moran and President of the American Vegan Society, Freya Dinshaw, will talk about their experience of the Vegan Summit. Alex Sershaft will follow with a report on the origins, objectives, and program of the Animal Rights National Conference, as well as the Summit for the Animals and the 1990 March on Washington. Culture and Animals Foundation Executive Director Martin Rowe will talk about his organization. Finally, we'll have Victoria Moran and author of Animal Factory's Jim Mason report on our movement's 2 early magazines, Vegetarian Times and The Animals Agenda. And then Victoria and Peter Singer will review the vegetarian and animal rights books and films that provided our movement's early intellectual support.
Vegetarian Summerfest, now called Vegan Summerfest, grew from that International Vegetarian Congress in 1975. So the North American Vegetarian Society has been producing an annual event with very few lapses. There was one for COVID-19 a couple of years. We didn't have a Summerfest, but otherwise this has been something that so many of us have counted on and depended on every single year. It's as if life happens at Vegetarian Summerfest. For starters, the speaker lineup is always stunning. Even people who are very, very busy and traveling a lot and can't stay for the whole week can at least come for part of the time. So you tend to get everybody who's big in the vegetarian world at any given time at Summerfest. Also, couples have met there. There have been weddings at Vegetarian Summerfest. And there have been memorial services. I think about the one in 2014 for Professor Ryn Berry, who is noted as the historian of the vegetarian and vegan movement. In fact, his birthday, January 31st, is now Vegetarian History Day. So Vegetarian Summerfest was traveling around a little bit in its early days, but settled quite some time ago on Johnstown, Pennsylvania, the University of Pennsylvania at Johnstown, and you can count on it. Every summer, there's a children's center where grown-up vegans, including my own daughter, remember spending time every summer of their life and being in the wonderful musical theater presentation that is still a part of every Summerfest. Also, a highlight is induction each year of some vegan into the Vegan Hall of Fame.
1975 World Vegetarian Congress. Subsequent conventions of the North American Vegetarian Society were called congresses, and eventually it became the Vegetarian Summerfest, and now it's the Vegan Summerfest. Brian and Sharon have been organizing those conferences on their own since about 1980, 1981, up until the present time, which is a phenomenal job. It's a very important week in people's year to attend a Summerfest and be with other vegetarians and learn from the speakers. There's the program and the lectures and so on, but there's things that happen, not out front, but really important things that are happening. Outside of the official program of a Congress, there are people getting together, talking to each other, having meetings and get-togethers on the spur of the moment. Let's meet tonight at such and such a room and talk about this. There's a lot goes on at these events that the organizers have no idea about. We'll get told about them later. There are a lot of speakers and a lot of topics on different aspects of vegetarianism and veganism to talk about. So there are frequently things happening at the same time. So you choose which class you're going to go to. And in the evening, there are plenary sessions when everybody gets together in the main hall and listens to the main blockbuster speakers. The food is amazing. There's breakfast, lunch, and dinner catered vegan under the direction of Mark Reinfeld, yes. He's got what was my job in the past.
Shortly after attending the life-changing 1975 World Vegetarian Congress in Orono, Maine, I launched the Vegetarian Information Service to distribute information on the merits of vegetarianism and to advocate before government agencies. We also ran an annual conference for our members. Some of the attendees in our conference spoke about animal rights, which I found strange but intriguing. Eventually, I got to know and respect some of these folks. I was impressed that they didn't eat animals either. By 1979, as I was helping Jim Mason edit his Animal Factories, I finally grasped the concept of animal rights and became a vegan animal rights activist myself. The following year, I decided to invite the animal rights folks to our next Action for Life conference to be held in July of 1981 in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Their idealism and enthusiasm took over the conference. The vegetarians gave up their ice cream and cheese and joined in. That event became the physical birthplace of the U.S. animal rights movement. During the next 4 decades, I ran 30 more animal rights national conferences designed to rally and unite our movement. These conferences had 5 objectives: to inform newcomers of the different forms of oppression that animals face, to train activists in self-improvement, organizing, advocacy, and other skills, to promote discussion of strategies in an atmosphere of mutual respect, to promote networking and inspiration among animal activists, to expose attendees to the many organizations working on behalf of animals. The conferences were held during the summer in major Washington or Los Angeles hotels that offered vegan food, feather-free bedding, and dog privileges. They would start on a Thursday afternoon and end on a Sunday night. Each day would begin with a plenary session featuring the day's announcements and a couple of key speakers. That was followed by 5 one-hour breakout periods, each offering 5 to 6 concurrent workshops on different topics, with a break for lunch and viewing of exhibits. Each of the nearly 80 workshops involved 2 to 3 presenters and a moderator. The evening plenaries offered brief presentations on topics of general interest. Saturday evening was reserved for the annual banquet, fundraising auction, and award presentations. Sunday evening hosted the farewell party with movement entertainers. Each day ended with a networking reception, offering samples of new plant-based food products, a cash bar, and ample networking opportunities. The more recent conferences featured as many as 170 presenters and 1,600 registrants from as many as 90 organizations and 12 countries, as well as 80 exhibits. These included animal rights organizations, plant-based meat and dairy food producers, cruelty-free cosmetics distributors, and t-shirt vendors. The conferences ground to a halt with the COVID pandemic in 2020 and never resumed. For many, they produced life-changing experiences. A number of new programs and organizations were launched there. A number of new activists got their start there. A number of new friendships were forged.
The Summit for the Animals was an annual one-day meeting of leaders of animal protection organizations established in 1985. Its purpose was to promote personal relationships, to discuss common problems, and to develop joint strategies. During the next 2 decades, nearly 50 organizations participated at one point or another. The greatest success of the summit was the 1990 March on Washington. On June 10, 1990, the National Alliance for Animals, headed by Peter Link, brought 25,000 animal activists for a March on Washington. This was our movement's largest event, co-sponsored by dozens of animal rights organizations. The march began at the Ellipse behind the White House with numerous organizational tables and speakers, and culminated on the west steps of the U.S. Capitol with more inspiring speeches. This occasion also served as a platform for a Declaration of Animal Rights signed by 50 organizations.
So the Culture and Animals Foundation started in 1985 in a number of different kinds of ways. I mean, Tom was lucky enough to get royalties from his books and also a stipend, more than a stipend, of course, salary from NCSU and from speaking engagements. And he wanted to do something with that. Nancy was very interested in the arts as well. And when they were attending a performance by the performance artist Rachel Rosenthal, both Tom and Nancy looked at one another and recognized that whereas scholarship, particularly in philosophy of animals, was important and was growing by the mid-1980s, the arts also had something to say. And so they decided to have these twin tracks, the scholarship angle and the artistic angle. So we have seen over the course of the 40 years that the Culture and Animals Foundation has been in business, the efflorescence of human-animal studies, which is now extended into critical animal studies and vegan studies and all sorts of aspects of thinking about other than human animals and diet and lifestyle, but also in the arts as well.
How did I come to start Animals Agenda, the news magazine of the animal rights movement? It was called when it came out. I think the first issue came out in December of 1979, and then it came out in an upgraded version in 1980, and then it became quarterly, and then it became a monthly. And it really took off probably in 1981 or 1982 because the animal movement, what was being called the animal rights movement in those days, began to get noticed, mainly because of PETA and some of the buzz around Peter Singer's book and Animal Factories. Animal rights was becoming a new thing. And you begin to see it mentioned in the mainstream press without the quotation marks. Animal rights became normalized. So the magazine was the organ, the mouthpiece for this development in the early to mid 1980s. And we became really kind of well known, I think, in the movement. We one time had a circulation of, in the United States and Canada, and I forget how many foreign countries, English-speaking countries. I think we had a circulation of 20, 30,000 subscribers. So we were widely read, and we covered all of the major developments in animal rights liberation movement at the time, exposure and the campaigns of PETA primarily. People for Ethical Treatment of Animals was exposing laboratories. Other animal groups were exposing cruelties in stockyards and slaughterhouses. And our magazine was able to cover most of these movement activities and generate stories about them and basically inform the movement about what we were doing to advance animal rights and animal liberation. So I think we were an essential mouthpiece for animals in the early to mid-80s when animal rights was really when the movement was really exploding on the scene as a new thing, getting a lot of media exposure. What was Animals Agenda like? What was the structure? What was the format? Well, it was magazines size, and at first it was just plain paper, black ink on white paper, stapled and folded. It was kind of like more like a newsletter in appearance. And then as we got more exposure and more support, grant money, subscribers, we could afford, we did a kind of a slick magazine, not super slick. We had a 4-color cover. It looked like a magazine. We got on newsstands. We had several sections. We had feature articles that were sent in by contributors. Typically, animal activists would write about a campaign or something of interest to the movement, some exposure of some new cruelty. So we had those main features. We had editorials. We had letters from readers. We had quite a few departments that were typical magazine-type departments that offered a range of opinions about what was being done for animals. And we kind of had a wide-angle view of animal activities. We didn't just confine our coverage to activities in the United States. We covered what our English, British Isles activists were doing. To some extent, other countries. So we tried to have kind of a widespread coverage of animal rights movement across national boundaries and languages, which gave us like a kind of a wide readership. So I think we were doing a good job of giving the movement, the budding movement, a place to go and express itself. Let activists participate in talking to each other. I remember thinking of it as a kind of a bulletin board, a classroom for the animal movement at the time.
I also met a very soft-spoken young man who asked if I would be interested in writing for his magazine, Vegetarian Times. Now, he had started Vegetarian Times in 1974 because he'd written an article about vegetarianism and nobody would publish it. So he thought, I'll start my own magazine. So it began as a newsletter, 4 pages, mimeographed, and he took it to health food stores in the Oak Park area and other Chicago suburbs. And it grew and grew. So by the 1980s, Paul had left his job as a registered nurse, and he was a full-fledged magazine publisher. Vegetarian Times had grown to 250,000 subscribers. Now, in the interim, he had sold controlling interest to a conglomerate, and when they were doing things with the magazine that he didn't like, he got some financial help from Mr. Rogers, the kids show host who was a vegetarian, and took it back. And then in 1990, Paul did sell the magazine outright, and I continued writing for them. I was their beauty editor for 20 years. And you can see the fact that they had a beauty editor, they were covering every aspect of what it means to live as a vegan or a vegetarian. Then with the sale, the magazine started to become more and more focused just on food and recipes. It was in print until 2016 and is now available digitally. Now, a little PS, we've lost Paul, as so many people who were around at that time are no longer with us. And Paul did move away from vegetarianism later in his life, but he saved so many animals for such a long time. He'll always be a hero for me. The first to come from an actual publishing house, Quest Books, in the 20th century was this book by Nathaniel Altman, Eating for Life. Now, there's a little story behind it in that Nathaniel was working at the Theosophical Society in America at that time, and so was I. So he would write each chapter of his book on his manual typewriter and bring it down to me in the library where I had a fancy electric typewriter. And I would be typing and typing Nathaniel's chapters and thinking, gosh, maybe someday I'll write a book. There was another book in 1971, shortly after the publication of Eating for Life, and this one went crazy. It sold 3 million copies, and that was Diet for a Small Planet by Frances Moore Lappé. She was suggesting that people go vegetarian for a reason we hadn't really heard much about before, and that was world hunger, because raising grains and soy to feed animals instead of people is not an efficient way to do things, and a lot more people could eat if we weren't eating animal foods. In 1975, a beautiful book came out, our first illustrated book in the vegetarian world, The Vegetable Passion by Janet Barkas. And in addition to talking about these wonderful foods, she also talked about vegetarianism within a historical context. In 1977, lots of people were back in the kitchen with the Moosewood Cookbook. This was by Molly Katzen, recipes from the Moosewood Kitchen in Ithaca, New York. Now, by then, a lot of us who were active in the movement were vegan, or certainly vegan at home. The Moosewood Cookbook had quite a bit of eggs and dairy in it, so most of us weren't reading it, but since 3 million other people did, it was extremely influential. In 1978, We had The Vegetarian Alternative by Vic Sussman. This was a book that really got sensible about nutritional advice, and it also had humane underpinnings. In 1979, we had Dudley Gale's book, The Vegetarian Way, in which he really set people straight about protein, which was an issue then and an issue still. And he also brought the three aspects of veganism that we all hold today: the health, the animals, and the environment. The first one in the 80s was Keith Akers' A Vegetarian Source Book. This was a very clear, complete guide to exactly why and how to go meatless in the 1980s. And it also brought in the environmental connection, which we hadn't heard much about yet. 100% on the health side of things was the 1983 book from Dr. John McDougall, The McDougall Plan. The first book that actually had the word vegan in the title came in 1985, and I'm proud to say that I wrote it, Compassion, the Ultimate Ethic, and Exploration of Veganism. I had actually gone 5 years earlier to the UK to research vegans as part of my degree in comparative religions from North Central College. I went to the UK because there were more vegans there and they were closer together. So Compassion, the Ultimate Ethic is looking at this way of life as a spiritual and moral imperative. Now, a much bigger book to come out that same year was Fit for Life by Harvey and Marilyn Diamond. Harvey had a PhD degree that he got some flack on later because it came from a correspondence school, but he and his very vivacious wife, Marilyn, had written a book that would be a phenomenon almost unequaled in publishing history. Fit for Life has sold 12 million copies. It's about eating fruit alone in the mornings before 12 o'clock. It's about eating a lot of salads, a lot of fresh, raw foods. In 1989, John Wynne Tyson, the lovely gentleman in the UK who had actually acted as my literary agent, unpaid, for Compassion, the Ultimate Ethic, came out with this anthology of humane thought called The Extended Circle. So you can see how many people had been talking about animals and living in a humane way for hundreds and hundreds of years, and John Wynne Tyson collected the information here.
Since animal liberation, there have been a lot of books published about animals. Already mentioned one that I wrote about Henry Spiro, Ethics into Action, which I think is useful for anyone interested in tactics, not only for the animal movement, but when dealing with corporate wrongdoing, whether it's for the environment or in other areas. I think that's certainly worth looking at. If you're interested in the history of the animal movement, as some of you may be, I'd like to mention this book called The Oxford Group and the Emergence of Animal Rights, because that talks about the group of people I mentioned that I was part of, who were vegetarians in Oxford, and the influence that they have had in terms of starting the animal movement. I want to mention that I have brought animal liberation up to date in Animal Liberation Now, 2023 version, that talks about progress that's happened since then and updates where we are with factory farming and with animals in research. The basic ethics didn't change very much. I think that's timeless. But I also want to mention that there have been a lot of new books, and one of the important things about them is that they approach the issue from different perspectives. I mentioned Tom Regan's book, The Case for Animal Rights, which takes a explicitly rights-based perspective, differing from my concern about reducing animal suffering. There's a book by the distinguished philosopher, American philosopher Martha Nussbaum, called Justice for Animals, which takes an approach that really, I suppose, stems ultimately from Aristotle and is sometimes called the capabilities approach. So that's another important way of looking at it.
We have so many incredible documentaries now in the vegan and the plant-based world, but one that was way ahead of its time was the Animals film. That was produced in 1981 by Victor Schoenfeld, who was an activist and journalist, British fellow. The movie was narrated by Julie Christie, very popular actress, in fact, movie star. This was the first documentary to look into what goes on in factory farms, in laboratories, with military research, animals in entertainment. Stunning first.
Thank you for watching episode 4 of 5 Decades, 1 Mission, which addressed the various ways our movement has rallied and consolidated through the years. We now invite you to watch episode 5, where we celebrate 8 of our movement's pioneers who are no longer with us. We welcome your comments on the 5 Decades, 1 Mission video series. Please email us at info@farmusa.org.